The Urbanist is brought to you in association with the Department of Culture and Tourism, Abu Dhabi. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is a beacon of hope and inspiration. A catalyst to spark growth and collaboration with museums and experiences, where art and science and nature and technology coexist.
The belief of Abu Dhabi that culture is the backbone of our society.
Stay tuned for a special episode of the show, in which you can hear His Excellency Mohammed Khalifa Al Mubarak explain exactly why and how Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is the perfect place to collaborate, create and innovate. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi, proud partner of The Urbanist on Monocle Radio.
Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up.
It made the persons with disability groups feel powerful, that they could actually get in a room with these officials and make their case known.
We're in the Philippines to see how good journalism can push the needle towards better livability in our cities. Then we head to Los Angeles to see how a new park has reconnected Wilmington residents with their waterfront and given those living next to the busiest container port in North America a respite from the hustle and bustle. And we flick through the pages of Monocle magazine's recent mobility special too. That's all coming up over the next 30 minutes right here on The Urbanist with me, Andrew Tuck. We, here at The Urbanist, for obvious reasons, would like to think that effective and evocative journalism can have a real physical effect on our cities. That's why we were so excited to learn about a new initiative from Rappler, the Philippines' leading digital media company, called Make Manila Livable. The idea aims to improve quality of life in Philippine cities through a collaborative effort from journalists and communities across the country. Monocle's Asia editor, James Chambers, recently caught up with Pierre Renada, Rappler's community lead, to find out more about what this new initiative aims to achieve.
Make Manila Livable is really a collaboration between journalists in Rappler and civil society groups on the ground who are advocating for issues on livability. So we have groups we've partnered with who are very concerned about bikers' rights, for example, or housing rights, open spaces, air pollution, disaster resilience in cities. So all of these issues are really linked by livability, except that a lot of Filipinos don't really think of livability as a all-encompassing issue. We usually think of it in terms of individual issues, and so this is the first time that really a newsroom is embracing this as a beat almost, and really linking up with grassroots groups, neighborhoods, communities to report about issues that they deal with on a daily basis.
As you said, people don't associate Manila with livability. It's normally floods, traffic, congestion, pollution. Why do you decide that now was the right time to do this?
We realized that a large part of our audience in Rappler were young Filipinos, so Gen Z, millennials, and we found that a lot of them were really interested in livability. And a lot of our stories that have to do with traffic, commuting problems, air pollution, open spaces and parks, these were issues that resonated with them. And we saw interest in our stories about these issues. And so we decided, why not devote a portion of our resources to reporting on this all-encompassing issue of livability and connect it with good governance. Another aspect of this is a lot of young Filipinos are now privileged enough to go abroad, experience the world, see cities, they get to study abroad. And a lot of these are young Filipinos who read Rappler and come back from those cities and think, why do we put up with Metro Manila the way it is? Why can't it be better? So I think it's important to tap into this sentiment, because that is the kind of sentiment that could change potentially how things are done in the Philippines. And we could use that kind of groundswell or that concern to mobilize governments and even our communities to make Manila more livable.
And in terms of how much success it has had already, I mean, you only started in February. The first point I want to get at is you're a journalist, Rappler is a media company. In terms of readership, how successful has this been?
It's hard to tell now, but just recently, we did this meeting where we assess how well certain stories did. And the story we did on Tomas Maroto Avenue, which is an iconic street in the biggest city in Metro Manila, Quezon City, there is a plan to pedestrianize it, to declare it car-free every Sunday. And that story did really well. And it was cited by our user journey analysts who check out the data analytics, the views of our stories, and that did really well. And that really just proves that livability is a big concern of our readers, and it's good journalism to cover that.
And I guess the second part of it I wanted to tackle is, I guess, the whole motivation behind doing this to make Manila more livable. How is that going? Are you having an impact already? Are you seeing any signs that what you're doing is moving the needle?
I think we have. So in small ways, even if this is a new initiative, we have already changed things a little bit. So for example, we had a story about how accessible the Metro Manila train system is for persons with disability. And that story led to an investigative report where we concluded, based on an audit we did with the persons with disability group who were our partners in Make Manila Livable, we concluded that 80% of the Metro Manila train system is inaccessible to persons with disabilities. And because of that report, in the budget hearing for the Transportation Department, who is in charge of the train system, lawmakers actually cited our report to ask the department, why is this the state of affairs for our train system? And that led to a meeting, number one, between the persons with disability group and the train contractors for new train lines, where the persons with disability groups were able to relay suggestions they have, like how to make the new train lines more accessible. And then it led to a second meeting where the train operators of existing train lines actually answered point by point each complaint, each observation we made in our report in this 3-hour-long meeting with various government agencies. So that actually led to real change. There was a direction ordered by the high-ranking government official present that the next project will be to put this ramp, which the rappel report says is missing in this train system. We're going to purchase more accessible ticket vending machines so that those with visual impairment are able to buy tickets without assistance. So those were real changes, and maybe they may not change everything. It's not maybe in the greater scheme of things, but we feel if it improved even a certain aspect of the train system, that at least it made some sort of an impact. And also it made the persons with disability groups feel powerful, that they could actually get in a room with these officials and make their case known. Since then, we've had really good partnerships with bikers' rights groups. We launched a bikers' rights initiative where the police came and also lawyers who talked about what is it in the Philippine law that protects bikers. So it's maybe a fledgling initiative, but I think we are gaining ground, and hopefully with more support, we're also able to make more impact.
In the Philippines, like a lot of Southeast Asian megacities and a lot of Asian cities, private businesses, the tycoons, have such an important part to play in the development of the city. Is this issue resonating with them as well?
I think it is, because if you look at the developments like malls that they're constructing now, there is a bigger sense of sustainability. That has become kind of a PR clarion call for a lot of these companies to gain a good reputation for being more green, and that has translated to things like promises by a major mall real estate developer to be carbon neutral by 2030. So there you hear these big companies making those declarations and promises, and in the way they construct their malls and their buildings, you can see they are leaning more to a more livable design, a more sustainable design. Instead of big chunks of concrete that's fully air conditioned, you have now malls that have more open space and more trees and more benches and more plants, playgrounds. So I think that sensibility is coming in, and I think largely that's partly because also of Filipinos being more attuned to what livability means. We have a huge Filipino diaspora all over the world, and lots of Filipinos live in extremely livable cities, and they come home with stories of how great it is to walk in Paris or how beautiful it is in Tokyo. And I think those stories really, for the families left behind, force them to ask, why are we putting up with a less than livable city?
I mean, this idea of a livable city is aspirational, it's the ideal, but when it comes down to it, in Manila, it often is about disasters and disaster resilience. We are talking just a few days after a typhoon struck and flooded a lot of the city. When you look at the coverage in the international media, they do love reporting the big numbers, but there's very little follow-up. How does Rappler cover a thing like a typhoon, and how are you reporting the aftermath?
We report knowing that people read the news so that they can get back on their feet as quickly as possible. So apart from learning about the damage, how much destruction was wrought by the typhoon, a lot of our audience are people who are just professionals or workers who need to normalize as fast as possible. And so we report it in a way that allows them to do that. We report not just on the damage, but also how 50% of electric connections have been restored, or things like this bridge is now passable, these roads are passable, where to get relief goods if government has started distributing aid, or like where to get calamity funds or a housing loan for your damaged house. So this is the way we cover it. We, apart from covering devastated houses, it's not enough. We have to show that news is going to help them get back on their feet rather than just scare people away.
And finally, what's next? You've been around for 5 months with Make Manila Livable. What have we got coming up for the rest of the year?
So we have 2025 elections. It's a national elections for the Philippines where we also elect, aside from senators and congressmen, new mayors. And so Metro Manila is composed of 16 cities and 1 town. And all of these are led by mayors. Cities all over the Philippines will depend on the next mayors for livability. Like, mayors really call the shots when it comes to what projects get funded, what priorities the government will have. So this really, Make Manila Livable, will evolve into a good governance campaign. So it's not just about livability and, people's experiences, but what kind of leader, what kind of mayor should you elect so that your city is more livable. And we think that people have to think critically in that way, because a lot of times in the Philippines, our mayors come from political clans, political families who it's almost a given, like for voters, that this person will get elected because his father was the mayor before. So we need to get away from that thinking and really assess mayors and candidates for what they can do to make our lives more livable and more pleasant.
Pierre Renada from Rappler there, speaking with Monocle's James Chambers. Next up today, we head to Los Angeles, to the port of Los Angeles in particular, the busiest container port in North America, with no fewer than 10 million shipping containers passing through last year. Just next door to the port are residential communities such as Wilmington, and those living there have had to put up with noisy lorries and the hubbub of maritime industry just outside their doors for many, many years. In 2011, the landscape architect firm Sasaki completed a new park that sought to reconnect local residents with their waterfront again, and the next phase of that revitalisation of the area has just opened. We sent our US editor, Chris Lord, down to take a look.
So I'm here at the very edge of the port of LA, and all around me, as you can hear, there are tankers rolling by. There's a big nest of cranes in the distance with various containers of all kinds of colours being loaded onto ships, offloaded. It's a very, very busy, packed port, and yet I've come to a tiny little quiet oasis just at its corner, a new park designed by the architecture firm Sasaki, and I'm here with one of their architects, Ian Dickinson. Ian, good to be with you.
Good to meet you too, Chris.
Ian, just give us a bit of background to this park. It's actually one of several that Sasaki has done around the port of LA. This is the latest one. What was the objective here? What did you set out to achieve?
Yeah, so as you said, Chris, this story goes back multiple decades and actually reaches back as far as 30 or more years, where we did the master plan that identified a series of open spaces that existed along the waterfront here, and then wanted to be able to stitch them together all with the same objective. One was being able to grant greater access back to the public and the surrounding community to its waterfronts, and then also to be able to adapt the existing infrastructure to be able to be more in tune with its natural setting.
So, of course, we're in Wilmington, which is a proper neighbourhood. There are houses not so far away, communities, people going about their daily lives who don't work in the port. But also, this port here just overwhelms their life, doesn't it? There are tankers rolling by all the time. There are big lorries coming through their neighbourhoods. Lots of big highways, and as you can hear, sounds like that as their soundtrack to the day.
And that's a lot of what our work is about, is trying to create those win-win scenarios in which you're able to allow the performative aspects of a space to be able to exist and remain, but to be able to have them be handled in a way that is much more accommodating to public and much more kind of inviting, we'll say, to the surrounding community.
Wilmington's new waterfront promenade, which was completed earlier this year, is the latest phase of Sasaki's revitalisation and clean-up of a vast brownfield site next to the port of LA. The firm's founder, Hideo Sasaki, who died in 2000, was best known as a landscape architect who would commit to rethinking areas over decades. his practice is revered for crafting desirable public spaces out of the morass of old urban factories and obsolete infrastructure. In Charleston, South Carolina, for instance, Sasaki transformed the Cooper River from a worn-out old maritime district that was long past its prime into a living parkland that still serves its community. So we're just walking up these set of staircases and we can see now we're getting a little bit higher with a view over the park. It's a strange case, LA, isn't it, in a way, Ian, because it is a city where you have these hyper-industrial spaces like the Port of LA, vast as it is, right next to little communities of low-rise bungalows.
Yeah, exactly.
There goes the train.
Yeah, perfect timing, yeah, right on cue. So exactly, I mean, these spaces where you have these kind of bizarro world settings where there's these kind of hyper-industrial, hyper kind of institutional properties set in proximity right next to single-family neighborhoods, and that strange and odd mix is something that is very indicative of Los Angeles and feels kind of very appropriate for the space. And so we're at the high point of the park, which is about 16 feet above what you'd say is kind of like settled grade here, and that's two functions. One is about being able to anticipate future storm surge and sea level rise, so environmental, ecological issues, but it's also to be able to prepare for a pedestrian bridge that is going to connect over the top of the rail line that you're hearing in the background here to be able to allow direct access from the surrounding communities to be able to get to the park space.
In reconnecting this community with the waterfront, no attempt is made to hide where we are. The highest point of the park, called the Landing, has views over rust-coloured refineries. Even the children's playground has aluminium slides that mimic the smokestack chimneys on the skyline. But somehow it works. What do the locals think of it? Cecilia Moreno has lived for most of her life in Wilmington and is Director of Community Relations at the Port of LA.
Having grown up in Wilmington, I didn't realize that we even had water that close. And going to the beach was a treat. I come from a very large Latino family, and it wasn't until later in life that I realized, holy cow, wait, there's like water right there, because we're just surrounded such an industrial community. You know, I'm very grateful, truthfully, to the industry that surrounds us, because I wouldn't be where I am today. But it was sad to also realize that I wasn't alone in that thought. And to now have this promenade that we've fought for many years, I'm proud to work at the port, but I also recognize having that waterfront project, it took many years to get there. It took a lot of community organizing and pushing back. So to now have that where people can sit on these swings or sit on these steps and just an active, busy port and the economic engine of this country is right there and they get to see it is just a treat.
Cecilia Moreno. Perhaps the most distinctive thing about this new park is its so-called promenade, blocks of cut onyx that allow visitors to walk right down to the lapping water. It's a smart idea, quite different from the typical marina-style elevation found in many other cities and waterfronts, where in a way the water is always kept at a bit of a distance. Philip Dugdale is co-director of Sasaki's office in New York and was a principal architect on the LA project.
With a seawall along water's edge, you don't really get to experience the tidal kind of changes in the water elevation. You don't really get to see that kind of temporal nature of the water. And what this allowed us to do was not only kind of improve the resiliency of the site by raising the flood elevation of the park, but also allowed us to create both a kind of an experiential quality to the water's edge that was, forever changing and different depending on when the visitor came to the park. How do we reinterpret that engagement with the water that isn't just viewing it and kind of like looking at it, but how does that change and how can it be different each time you come back to the park?
Here's local resident Cecilia Moreno again.
It's a beautiful thing when I drive into Wilmington and I see the high school kids and they're on the bus, they get off at Harry Bridges and they're walking across to that. These kids are on their skateboard, on their bike after school, heading all the way over there to go and enjoy that. Whether it's seniors to the parents and the folks taking their dogs to go walk them, it is just rewarding. It makes coming into work in those frustrating days worth it.
For Monocle in Los Angeles, I'm Chris Lord.
Now, before we go today, we wanted to take a look through the pages of the latest edition of Monocle magazine, a mobility special which will be hitting shelves from today. I'm joined now by Monocle's design editor, Nick Manise, who had a hand in making this edition happen. Nick, welcome to The Urbanist. Now, can we begin with a bit of background as you see it on what we're looking to uncover in this edition of the magazine?
I think it's one of those things. Mobility is almost like death and tax. Maybe not death and taxes. Maybe eating and breathing. Like it's something that we have to do. And I think what makes this such a fascinating topic is that you can work across a host of different scales. So obviously, there's walking. At its simplest form, we're talking pedestrians, but we can jump through to cycling, driving, trams, trains, planes, automobiles. I mean, I've already said cars, but you get. I wanted to get that in there. But there's this whole spectrum that we can explore, obviously through the various different lenses that we look at things in the magazine. So we've commissioned a huge survey in the business pages, which you take care of. Making a case for a host of different transport modes. The design section, we designed the perfect train. Now, sort of observation pages at the start of the magazine. We're also looking at how we move goods to and from cities. So there were all these different kind of lenses that we looked at this concept from.
And I think what's interesting is, that's why it was so great having you involved in so many stories, because these stories work on a design level, on an industrial design level, on an architectural level. In many instances, they work as economic stories. They work as business stories, as you said. So it's fascinating seeing them all come together. You've picked out a few stories that we can highlight for listeners. The first one is from Gregory Scruggs up in Puget Sound.
And the reason I picked this is I think it shows that scale that I was sort of alluding to earlier. So this is a story about the Puget Sound pilots, and they are, I guess, naval captains that board cargo ships and help guide them through the, and I'm going to use Gregory's words here, but labyrinthine waterways of the Puget Sound to make it to the major US ports of Seattle and Tacoma. So it's looking at how we get goods into our cities, and that's why I quite like this. So Gregory jumped on board the Liberty Pride, which appropriately was carrying 4,500 cars from South Korea into Washington State, and obviously they were being dispersed beyond that. But again, the reason I picked this is I do like the fact that it not only looked at, I guess, the global reach of mobility, and the significance of these pilots and the role that they play in terms of getting goods into our cities, cars onto our streets. And I think that was what was most fascinating about it. But I think Greg had to climb a ladder with no safety net. Do we have insurance for him? I don't know.
Him, the photographer, they all had to scamper up the side of the ship. What an
huge, like meter drop with no harness. So, and we've got a photo of that in the magazine. So that is reason alone to pick it up. You can see Greg's, if you don't mind me saying, Gregory, tidy behind, climbing into a ship. So that's quite exciting.
Go, Gregory. Now, a story closer to home in many ways for you, a story from Australia, from Sydney, where they've been extending the subway network. And, this is an architectural story. And again, this is the marrying of all these elements that we have always in a Monocle story. Tell us about this.
So this one, and the reason I wanted to talk about this is, Sydney is a remarkable city, but its biggest asset is also its biggest weakness. It's got this, huge, glorious, beautiful harbour, but it really cuts the city up and makes it incredibly difficult to move around. So it becomes quite car reliant. So finding ways to move around where we can, have better transit options is incredibly important for Sydney-siders, and that's what this project is about. So it's the biggest, I guess, transit project in Australia. Construction started in 2014. It's called the Sydney Metro Project, quite simply, but the crowning jewel is the City Line, which has just opened, and that is in the city centre. So it was 6 new stations, a host of connections through the CBD. That makes this so important for people looking to commute into the office and into the city, at all hours of the day.
And again, it's nice how design then nudges people into kind of changing their patterns of how they travel around a city. Where to next?
So we're going to jump from Sydney. Well, actually, we're going to leave the metro and get into some tiny cars. And I wanted to pick this one because this was your doing. And I think this is a remarkable, I've got it up in front of us, but it's a roundup of a host of tiny vehicles and looking at these kind of micro-mobility solutions or small cars for negotiating busy and compact urban environments. So do you have a pick of the bunch?
What I liked about there's the Microlino, which the founders of that company came to the Quality of Life conference. Book your tickets for this year, by the way. Came to the Quality of Life conference in Munich last year. And what's interesting is I think how these tiny cars, these tiny electric cars, are allowing not only the giant players in the automobile world to get in on the act. So it's interesting. There was quite a lot of companies who are now moving into making cars in a way that I don't think you could have done if you were just like making the world of giant Cadillacs from a generation ago.
Yeah, and I think there's also an element of, there's obviously safety things like smaller vehicles are safer to drive in busy urban environments just because of the potential impact that they can have. But it's also about, I guess, making our streets and our cities a little bit friendlier. And I spend a lot of time in the US, and you've got these big hulking pickup trucks and just the imposing nature of them, and the fact that you then need to design infrastructure to respond to that can lead to quite unpleasant city streets and city environments. So it's also looking at that link between the actual vehicles that we use to get around our cities and the scale of our cities as well.
And the other thing that's interesting is because now we're going to jump to Zurich, where a company called Flink is making a new version of the cargo bike. Switzerland's kind of jumping on the saddle of this one. They like the idea of cargo bikes doing that last mile delivery, and also for parents and things, delivering their kids around the city. And it's a kind of made in Switzerland brand as well. A really nice story.
Yeah, so this is Flink, actually, and there's a few, you touched on it there, there's a few Swiss cargo bike companies. I don't know what it is. I would typically have associated this sort of story with Denmark or the Netherlands, but really Switzerland is starting to kind of lead the charge on these Swiss-designed, made bikes. So Flink is a company that essentially has just created this beautiful model, but it's all about the flexibility and the options that it gives you. So it's got a beautiful cargo carrier on the front. You could pop a child on there, you could pop your dog in a basket on there, you can pop your, there's a crate for doing your shopping. And I think it's these sorts of things, it's making riding more accessible because it doesn't mean you have to alter your behaviour as much. And I think that's often the struggle that I guess bikes have versus cars. It's like cars offer us so much convenience. You don't even have to think about it. You don't have to change clothes. You can just jump straight in, transport whatever you want. But this cargo bike is ultimately that's who they're competing with. They're trying to compete with cars in a way by making your life so much easier and so much easier to move around.
And a final story, Nick. This one, oh my God, this has taken quite a long time to come into the station, because this is your take on the perfect train. And it's so detailed. This illustration is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, this was a real team effort. We had lots of input. We decided to design the perfect monocle train, and everyone does have their opinion. Everyone wants to make sure that their opinion is reflected in this. But it was quite nice. I mean, we broke it down. I think there's something like 20 odd components, 23 different components. But we looked at the perfect train, but we also zoomed out to the station itself. And again, it's moving from those tiny little details, like having the right gentle lighting. I mean, there's nothing worse than sitting across from your significant other, both, ragged and worn down from a day of travel, and then being illuminated by horrific fluorescent lighting. So we want to make sure there's some mood lighting on the train. So it's things like that, through to, having a phone booth for if you're going to be noisy and need to make a phone call. I mean, Sophie Grove, the editor of Confect, and I were on a train in Switzerland last week, and the people next to us broke out a game of Yahtzee. So dice is kind of like crackling on the table, them shouting. And I tell you what, if we could have put them in a booth, that would have been sensational. I mean, are there what's an essential requirement for you of any perfect train?
Well, let me think about it. So, yeah, I like to have somewhere you can actually plug your phone in. I like actually a train where the Wi-Fi actually works, because I think most of the trains you get on, they encourage you to log onto the Wi-Fi and it stops after like 2 or 3 seconds.
Yes.
The Eurostar, which we use quite a lot now going to Paris, it's like there's so many points on that journey where you just cannot get it to work. So it's like you're trying to tether to your hotspot. And I think a chair that's comfortable. One of the amazing things years ago when we travelled, me and my partner in Japan, it was great doing some of the long Shinkansen journeys, and the fact that when you got off the train, they could just pull a lever and turn the seats 180 degrees, so you could always be facing the point that you were going to. And I think just simple things like that, it's just like little elements of design that make the experience beautiful.
Absolutely. Well, that sounds like a chair I would like to sit in.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Nick, for joining us on The Urbanist. And our mobility special edition of Monocle magazine is out now. Well, that's all for this week's edition of The Urbanist. Remember, you can get new editions of the show every week. Just follow us through your favourite podcast provider. You can also subscribe to Monocle magazine for regular reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism, including this month's mobility special. Just visit monocle.com. The Urbanist is produced by Carlotta Rebello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.